Her daughter-in-law gave her a paper plate on her birthday at her own table. Her son smirked, called it no big deal, and went back to scrolling. Maggie Dorsey, retired school principal and widow, didn't argue. By summer, their garage code would be dead, their tenancy revoked, their access erased. She'd housed them as family, now she filed them under occupants, and when they demanded re-entry, the title deed spoke louder than blood. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The scent of overcooked roast lingered in the air, mingling with the faint smell of lemon-scented wood polish that Trina always overused before guests arrived, except there were no guests tonight. Just family, though the word felt increasingly misused in this house. Maggie Dorsey sat at the end of the dining table, her hands resting lightly in her lap as she watched Trina float from one seat to the next, carefully placing blue-rimmed china plates in front of each person like she was hosting a garden club luncheon. The plates sparkled, freshly pulled from the glass cabinet Maggie's late husband John had built with his own hands over 20 years ago. A matching set of antique silverware clinked gently against porcelain as Trina laid them down with rehearsed elegance. Maggie's eyes tracked the rhythm of it, plate, fork, napkin, soft smile, until Trina reached her. For a brief second, Maggie thought the rhythm would hold, that she too would receive the same consideration, the same unspoken dignity offered to the others. Instead, Trina broke the pattern. Without fanfare or the faintest hint of embarrassment, Trina reached into a crinkled plastic shopping bag, pulled out a disposable white paper plate and a single plastic fork wrapped in a scratchy napkin, and set it in front of Maggie. No eye contact, no explanation, just a quick shrug of the shoulders and a muttered, "Figured that was easier for you?" Before Maggie could say anything, Eli, sitting 2 chairs down, phone in hand, let out a light chuckle without looking up. "Less to clean up, right?" he added, tapping his screen with his thumb, as if the moment didn't carry the sharp weight of something irreversible. Maggie didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her silence was practiced, deliberate, a stillness that came from decades of surviving conversations where the real meaning was always tucked behind tone and timing. Her fingers didn't reach for the plate. She simply looked at it for a few moments longer than anyone else at the table seemed to notice. Anyone except Micah. Seated directly across from her, Micah glanced up between bites of mashed potatoes. The moment his eyes landed on her paper plate, the faint smile he'd been wearing disappeared. He looked to Eli, then to Trina, and back to his grandmother. With a quiet grace beyond his 17 years, he slid his chair slightly, reached across the table, and swapped his plate for hers. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Maggie gave him the smallest nod, subtle enough that Trina missed it entirely, but warm enough to make Micah's shoulders relax just slightly. She ate slowly, the china fork gliding softly against the porcelain, the roast a bit dry, but still passable. Conversation drifted around her, Eli talking about a possible promotion that hadn't materialized, Trina bragging about the minimalist update she made to the hallway wall. Micah remained quiet, pushing peas around his plate, his eyes flicking toward Maggie every few minutes like he was making sure she hadn't disappeared inside herself. Eventually, Maggie's gaze followed Trina's hand as she gestured toward the new gallery of family photos she'd arranged. It was positioned perfectly on the main wall, right where the old oil painting of the Dorsey farmhouse used to hang. Every frame matched, every photo printed in glossy color. There were snapshots of Micah at his first varsity game, Eli grilling in the backyard, even a photo of Trina and her sister on the porch with glasses of wine. But nowhere, not in a single frame, was Maggie. Her absence on that wall was louder than any insult they could have spoken out loud. After dinner, she excused herself with a calm smile and a quiet, "Thank you," though she hadn't been thanked for anything. She made her way upstairs, each step of the staircase creaking beneath her feet like it was remembering who built this home, who scrubbed its floors, who paid off the last of the mortgage while everyone else was still trying to find their place in the world. In the privacy of her room, she shut the door softly behind her and paused. The silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt expectant. She walked over to the cedar trunk beneath her bedroom window, the one with brass hinges and a broken lock she never bothered to fix. Inside were old tax returns, photographs, small keepsakes wrapped, Indian tissue, and tucked at the bottom, sealed in a thick plastic sleeve, the original property deed. She unfolded it on her bed and smoothed the corners. The name on the document hadn't changed. Margaret Ann Dorsey. No co-signers, no amendments, no transfers. Just her name, alone, in black ink, unmoved by time, unmoved by manipulation. She sat on the edge of the bed and let her fingers rest lightly on the signature line, not with hesitation, but with memory. The kind of memory that made your back straighten, your eyes sharpen, and your pulse slow to something fierce. Across the room, the desk lamp cast a warm circle of light over her notepad. Maggie stood, walked toward it, and with steady hands pulled a pen from the drawer. She opened a fresh page and wrote a single word across the top. Reclaim. She paused, then underlined it, twice. And just below it, in smaller letters, she began her plan. The attic door groaned softly as Maggie pushed it open, her hand steady on the railing. Dust floated like ghost light in the sharp morning sun that poured through the small half-moon window at the far end. This space hadn't changed much over the decades. No one had dared to. It still smelled like cedar and mothballs, like tucked-away sweaters and forgotten summers. She climbed the narrow steps with deliberate care, a flashlight wedged under one arm, a ring of old brass keys clinking in her pocket. Her back ached a little from the night before, but her mind was clearer than it had been in weeks, maybe months. The far corner of the attic still held John's army trunk, layered with 2 wool blankets and a frayed quilt she'd meant to donate. Beneath those, hidden behind the edge of an old rocking horse, was the small fireproof safe, black, scratched, and heavier than she remembered. Maggie knelt down, easing her knees onto the floorboards. She selected the second key on the ring and slid it into the lock. It turned with a low click that felt less like sound and more like release. Inside, everything was where she had left it. The original deed sat atop the stack, sealed in its protective sleeve. She took it out, just to hold it again, just to remind herself how real her name looked in ink. She didn't need to check it again, but she did anyway. There it was, Margaret Ann Dorsey, sole owner. No caveats, no signatures beside hers, no blurred lines to be interpreted by anyone. A soft knock on the attic's half-door startled her. She turned to see Mrs. Lennox leaning inside, holding a travel mug in one hand and wearing the same windbreaker she wore on morning walks since 1993. The scent of strong coffee reached Maggie before the smile did. "I brought caffeine and moral support," Mrs. Lennox said, stepping over a box of old Christmas lights. Maggie stood slowly, wiping dust from her hands. "You always bring both when it matters." Mrs. Lennox handed over the mug. "You ready to reclaim the walls?" Maggie didn't answer right away. She just looked down at the deed again, the corners still crisp after all these years. Then she nodded. Not a theatrical one, just a slow, certain tilt of the head. Downstairs, after Mrs. Lennox left, Maggie sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a Sharpie. She drew 3 clean boxes across the top of the page and labeled them Week 1, Week 2, Week 3. No fanfare, no speeches, just the quiet certainty of a woman who'd spent her life planning school budgets and end-of-year assemblies. Strategic, measured, quiet. She wasn't going to announce anything. She wouldn't raise her voice. No fireworks, just the slow, methodical undoing of what they'd tried to rewrite. Later that afternoon, Maggie stood in the garage, wiping cobwebs from a plastic bin labeled Fragile Memories. She had opened it looking for old extension cords, but found something better. Tucked between holiday lights and faded tree skirts was a photograph she hadn't seen in years. It was a wide-angle shot, a little grainy, but unmistakable. Her and John standing in front of the house on the day they'd paid off the mortgage. She was wearing his oversized flannel shirt, he had a paint roller in one hand and his other arm around her waist. Both of them were laughing like they had just won the world. She barely had time to take it in before Micah appeared in the doorway, hands in the pockets of his hoodie. "What's that?" he asked. Maggie held it up for him to see. Your grandfather before he started getting gray, and me before the knees started creaking." Micah smiled, then reached for the photo without hesitation. "Can I hang it in my room?" That surprised her more than anything else that week. "Of course," she said. By dinner, the photo was framed and pinned above Micah's desk. Maggie spotted it while walking past his room and felt something unspoken settle in her chest, like a flag planted on familiar ground, but not everyone saw it that way. Later that night, Trina stood just inside Micah's room, arms crossed, voice low but unmistakably sharp. "We don't need to keep dragging old energy into your future," she said, glancing toward the photo with disapproval barely concealed beneath a tight smile. "It's time to let go of things that keep us stuck." Micah didn't answer her. He just picked up his headphones, sat back down at his desk, and turned the photo slightly toward himself. The hardware store parking lot was nearly empty when Maggie pulled in, her hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than she needed to. It had rained earlier, just enough to darken the pavement and leave that metallic smell clinging to the air. She parked beneath a flickering overhead light, killed the engine, and sat for a moment, the silence in the car far more comfortable than the one she left behind in the house. She double-checked the paper in her purse. Daniel Park, locksmith, referred by Mrs. Lennox's niece. Young, quiet, and discreet. Maggie had called him the day before, careful to phrase her request as a general security update. No details. Not yet. Inside, the shop was warmer than expected. A row of pre-packaged deadbolts lined one wall, next to a glass case filled with blank key cards and modern touchpad systems. It smelled faintly of metal shavings and coffee that had been left on the burner too long. A man in a denim work shirt looked up from behind the counter. His hair was tied back in a short ponytail, face clean-shaven, movements deliberate. "Mrs. Dorsey?" he asked, as if confirming something important, not just a name. She nodded, approaching with slow confidence. "Daniel Park?" He gave a small nod and gestured to the side counter. "Why don't we sit?" They moved to a small table tucked near the employee entrance. Maggie rested her handbag on her knees. Daniel folded his hands, waiting. There was something calming about his stillness. Not cold, just steady. Maggie had known men like him before. Careful listeners. People who didn't waste words. "I need to ask something," she said, watching his eyes. "Is it legal for someone to restrict me from parts of my own house, even if we're related?" Daniel didn't blink. "Only if your name isn't on the deed," he said plainly. "And from what I understand, yours is." Maggie nodded once. "Every letter of it." He leaned forward slightly. "Then no one has the right to deny you access to any part of that property. Not legally. Not morally." It wasn't the words themselves that anchored her. It was the way he said them, like he was reading aloud something that had always been true. Something Maggie just needed to hear spoken by someone who understood how injustice often wears polite faces. "I'd like to make some changes," she said. "To the locks, the access, everything." Daniel offered a faint smile. "We can do that. Smart locks? Biometric panels?" "Let's keep it simple but thorough," she replied. "And invisible, if possible." He slid a form across the table for her to sign, just a standard authorization. Maggie signed without hesitation, already knowing this was the first step of a larger plan she would execute in silence. The next morning, while Trina and Eli were out at a networking brunch and Micah was at school, Daniel arrived with a small toolbox and an unmarked van. No loud drilling, no unnecessary movements. Just precise, clean work. Within 90 minutes, the entire house, front door, garage, even the basement access, was operating on a new system with a private code only Maggie knew. Upstairs, Maggie opened her linen closet and removed a padded file box containing receipts, instruction manuals, and warranty slips for nearly every major appliance in the house. She spent the next hour with Mrs. Lennox, cataloging which items had been purchased before Eli and Trina ever arrived. The coffee table? Heron the basement sectional? Heron the washer and dryer? Also hers, though Trina had taken to calling them ours in conversation. every list Maggie made was duplicated. One paper copy, one in a cloud folder that Daniel helped her set up using a secure email address no one in her family knew existed. Mrs. Lennox stayed until late afternoon, her penmanship tidy, her presence grounding. By evening, Maggie sat alone at the kitchen island with a catalog of emergency supplies open in front of her. She ordered a portable generator, a month's worth of shelf-stable meals, and a discreet battery pack for her phone. Every purchase felt like a stitch in a safety net she hadn't realized she needed until now. She moved through the rooms slowly that night, flipping light switches, locking and unlocking the new keypads, memorizing the clicks and tones. Her home felt different, not yet safe, but no longer vulnerable. Back in her room, she wrote a new word beneath reclaim on her legal pad: fortify. She was halfway through underlining it when she heard the faint creak of the back steps. The door opened. "Who changed the garage code?" Eli's voice called out, sharp and annoyed. Maggie didn't move. She capped her pen and waited. The next morning, Maggie poured herself a cup of black coffee and stood at the kitchen sink, watching condensation streak lazily down the glass. The forecast promised rain by mid-afternoon, but Peoria's clouds never liked being predictable. She preferred it that way lately, storms on her terms. Trina moved behind her with a clatter of ceramic mugs and the rustle of paper. "I'm going to need the dining room cleared out by Thursday," she said, like she was talking to a part-time assistant, not the woman who owned the floorboard she stood on. "I've got the caterer scheduled and I want the furniture shifted for Flo." Maggie turned slightly, offered a small, polite smile. "Of course, whatever you need." It was a sentence she'd said 100 times over the years. This time it landed differently. She took her coffee to the front room, sat in John's old recliner, and opened the file folder she'd tucked under the cushion the night before. Her eyes didn't drift to the gallery wall this time. Let them hang their curated memories. She'd begun building something more resilient, something invisible. At exactly 2 o'clock that afternoon, Daniel arrived through the side entrance with a canvas tool roll and a blueprint Maggie had printed from her email. She met him at the top of the stairs and led him to the master bedroom first. There, he installed the first reinforced latch, low profile, strong enough to hold even if someone leaned into it with their full weight. By the time they reached the upstairs hallway, 3 more were marked and drilled. "I want to know I can sleep without listening for footsteps," she told him quietly. Daniel gave a single nod. "You will." Later that week, while Trina was still finalizing the floral arrangements for her self-declared anniversary vibe dinner, Maggie placed 6 private calls to old friends she hadn't seen in years. No one from church, no one in Trina's circles, just women who remembered the sound of her laugh before it got filtered through strained politeness. She hosted her gathering 2 nights before Trina's grand dinner, quietly, in the sunroom. It was simple, no fuss. Homemade meatloaf, green beans with bacon, a bottle of wine someone had brought as a housewarming gift back in '91, and they'd all forgotten existed. There was laughter, some soft music and stories that began with, "Do you remember when John fell through the attic?" After dessert, Maggie stood, collected her plate, and looked around the room. Once filled with warmth, now papered with someone else's priorities. She excused herself and walked into the living room. One by one, she began removing things. A crystal frame from the mantel, the porcelain anniversary clock her sister had sent her in 1985, a wedding photo, just her and John on the courthouse steps, her bouquet slightly crooked, his tie blowing sideways in the wind. Each piece was wrapped in cloth and tucked into a deep cedar chest upstairs. She didn't rush. She wasn't hiding. She was preserving. Not everything needed to be visible to be real. As she moved down the hallway with the last bundle in her arms, she caught Micah leaning against his doorframe. His headphones were around his neck, a game controller idle in one hand. "You okay?" he asked, his voice quiet enough to land gently. Maggie paused, then shifted the bundle into one arm and reached out to him with the other. He didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, taller now than she remembered him being even last month, and wrapped his arms around her without asking any more questions. She held on for a moment longer than she meant to. The next morning, Trina woke early and swept into the kitchen in a flurry of purpose. She had her phone on speaker, her voice rising with excitement as she paced. Yes, I need the full package, pasta station, past hors d'oeuvres, something gluten-free for Eli's mother, if she actually shows up. Maggie waited until she stepped out to take another call. Then she walked over to the calendar pinned above the pantry door. She scanned the date Trina had circled in red marker, then picked up the house phone and called the catering company herself. "This is Margaret Dorsey," she said clearly. "I need to cancel the order for Saturday evening." "Yes, that's correct. No, there won't be a reschedule." She hung up slowly, pressing the receiver back into its cradle like the weight of it mattered. The storm hit just before sunrise. Not rain, wind. Sharp, restless gusts that rattled the porch swing and pressed tree branches against the windows like impatient fingers. Inside, the house was quiet, but the stillness felt more like a held breath than peace. Trina reached the garage door in a rush, tote bag slung over one shoulder, car keys in hand, muttering about being late for her strategy consult. She tapped the keypad mounted beside the doorframe, once, twice, nothing. The red light blinked. She tried again. Still nothing. "Eli," she called down the hall, voice already edged with panic. "Did you mess with the garage code again?" Eli emerged, shirtless, half asleep, rubbing his eyes. "Number, I haven't touched it since Tuesday. Try the front door." Trina stormed upstairs, heels echoing sharply on the hardwood. The front door keypad greeted her with a soft chime, then flashed "Access denied" in muted blue. She froze. What the hell? Eli joined her, now fully awake, trying his own code. No luck. "This has to be a glitch," he said, more to himself than her. "It was working last night." Trina's eyes narrowed. She did something. They both stood in the foyer, staring at the uncooperative keypad like it had betrayed them personally. The silence in the house stretched long, too long for coincidence. Eli reached for his phone and called Maggie's cell. Upstairs in her room, Maggie was already dressed, sipping hot tea from a ceramic mug Micah had made in 7th grade. The screen lit up with Eli's name, and for a moment, she let it ring. Then she answered, calm as still water. "Good morning," she said pleasantly. "Mom?" Eli began, voice sharp. "What's going on with the locks?" "None of the codes work." Maggie set the mug down gently on her nightstand. "There's been an update," she said. "New policy, owner access only." There was a pause on the line. "Are you serious?" "I am," she said. "Check your email." Eli hung up without another word. Downstairs, his phone chimed with a new message. The subject line read, "Formal notice of termination, basement tenancy." Attached were 2 PDF documents. One was a detailed letter outlining their infractions: unauthorized code tampering, repeated verbal disrespect, and targeted exclusion on private occasions. The second was a time-stamped PDF of the property deed. Trina stood behind him as he read, arms folded so tightly across her chest it looked like she was holding herself together. "This can't be legal," she said, the words brittle. "She can't just evict us." "She can," Eli muttered, scrolling through the email again. "She owns the house. But it's been 2 years. We have a right to stay, don't we?" Her voice climbed higher with every word. Maggie sent a second email an hour later. No greeting, just a scanned copy of their original temporary housing agreement, signed only by Maggie, and the clause they had both chosen to ignore, subject to review or revocation at owner's discretion. Trina's response came swiftly, a long, hissing voicemail full of legal threats, references to emotional trauma, and vague claims about community reputation. Maggie didn't listen to the whole thing. She simply forwarded the voicemail to Daniel, who replied within 5 minutes, "All legal, all enforceable. Clock starts now." Mrs. Lennox stopped by that afternoon with a tin of lemon bars and a kind of satisfaction she didn't bother masking. She read the printed eviction notice on the kitchen table, set the tin down, and nodded once. "This isn't petty," she said, her voice steady as ever. "This is protection." Maggie didn't reply right away. She was standing at the window watching Trina through the living room blinds. She'd taken to pacing the front walk, phone pressed to her ear, voice sharp and desperate. Eli sat on the porch steps behind her, silent, hunched, unreadable. Inside, Maggie turned back toward the room and lifted her teacup with a small, quiet breath. Her hands didn't shake. Micah heard them arguing before he even opened the basement door. He'd just come home from school, later than usual. He'd taken the long way, looped through a park, sat on a bench near the river with his earbuds in but no music playing. Just time, just space. Enough of it to think. Now, from the top of the steps, he could hear his parents' voices behind the basement door. Not yelling, not loud enough for Maggie to hear upstairs, but sharp in that way that made your skin itch. "She's not thinking straight. She's old," Trina was saying. "You can't just let her manipulate you with guilt." "She's isolating herself," Eli added, "cutting us out. It's not normal." Micah rested his hand on the banister, then let it drop. "She changed the locks," Trina continued, her voice hissing now. "What kind of person does that to their own family?" There was a pause, then Eli again, tired, defensive. "Micah, she's dragging you into this. You can't let her poison your future. We need to be a united front." Micah stepped back, slow and quiet, and walked past the basement door without a sound. They hadn't heard him come in. They hadn't even looked for him. Upstairs, he opened the hall closet and grabbed the old duffel bag Maggie had once used for weekend trips to the lake. He tossed in a hoodie, a few shirts, socks, a book or two, his toothbrush. Quiet, efficient movements. Like a kid who knew exactly what part of the house didn't creak. Maggie was at the kitchen table, filling out a form in blue ink. Her glasses sat low on her nose. She looked up when she heard his footsteps. "I'm gonna crash on the couch for a while," Micah said, simply. Maggie didn't ask why. She didn't need to. She just gestured to the hall linen cabinet. "Extra blankets are on the middle shelf." Micah gave her a small nod and disappeared down the hall. Once he was out of sight, Maggie returned to the form in front of her, an emergency contact update for her primary physician. She drew a clean line through Eli Dorsey and left the space blank. 2 hours later, after sunset, Daniel arrived with a small gray lockbox. It was sleek, keypad-controlled, discreet enough to tuck inside a nightstand. "Put anything in here you don't want anyone else touching," he said, placing it on the table. "You'll be the only one with the code." Maggie opened the lid and ran her fingers along the velvet-lined interior. She thought of the envelope labeled Plan B. She thought of the deed. She thought of her husband's wedding ring, still tucked in the ceramic box in her dresser. "Thank you," she said. "I'll be on standby this week," Daniel replied. "If things escalate." Maggie offered a faint smile. "I think they already did." That night, as she pulled the last of her utility bills from the hall file drawer, she opened her laptop and logged into her auto-pay dashboard. One by one, she removed her name from the shared accounts: gas, electric, trash pickup. Let them see what it costs to live here without her name quietly making it all run. She had just closed the laptop when she heard Eli's voice behind her. "You're being vindictive." Maggie turned slowly in her chair, keeping her voice level. "Am I? You changed the locks, canceled the dinner, locked us out of half the house? You handed me plastic," she said, cutting him off. Her voice was soft, controlled. "On my birthday. In my home. You laughed while you did it. Don't talk to me about cruelty, Eli." "Not after that." His mouth opened, but nothing came out. For a second, the silence between them was so complete it almost hummed. "You think this is about a plate?" he finally asked, his voice cracking with something that might have been shame or panic. Maggie stood, not rushed, not defensive, just firm. "Number that plate," was just the moment I realized I'd been set at the wrong table. The storm rolled in without warning. No thunder, just a thick, tense wind that carried the kind of heat you couldn't trust. Maggie stood in the kitchen, holding a paring knife in one hand and a half-peeled potato in the other, when the lights flickered once, then cut out completely. The house dropped into instant stillness. She didn't panic. She simply set the knife down, turned toward the pantry, and counted 10 seconds under her breath. Then, with a low click and a soft hum, the backup generator roared to life. The fridge kicked back on. A warm glow returned to the living room lamp. Her hallway nightlight blinked once, then steadied. Upstairs was covered. The main floor was covered. But the basement stayed dark. Maggie walked to the back window and pulled the curtain aside. No lights across the street. The whole neighborhood had gone out, just as Daniel had warned her could happen this time of year, especially if the grid was pushed. But Maggie's side of the house stood lit and quiet, like a pocket of calm inside chaos. Then came the banging. Trina's voice rose sharply through the stairwell, loud enough to reach the top step. "Maggie, the power's out downstairs. Hello?" Another knock, this time fast, like panic biting at the edge of her control. "We've got food in the fridge down here. Micah's charger was plugged in. Can you at least tell us what the code is?" Maggie turned away from the window and reached for the flashlight on the counter. She didn't answer. Not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. Some things didn't require discussion anymore. She turned the beam toward the drawer beside the stove and pulled out the cast-iron skillet. She'd already planned on roasting vegetables tonight, but now it would be by flashlight and flame. She lit the stove manually, struck a match like she used to when she and John would go camping in southern Missouri. The hiss of the burner igniting felt oddly comforting. Micah appeared a moment later, rubbing his shoulder and yawning, still in socks. "I figured they'd be yelling by now." "They've started," Maggie said, her tone light, dry. Micah moved to her side, picked up a cutting board, and began slicing carrots without needing instruction. "You want the onions thin or thick?" "Thin," she said. "We're aiming for elegance." They worked quietly for a few minutes, trading tools and flicking flashlight beams toward each other when needed. Maggie found herself smiling, not out of revenge, not even out of relief, but something quieter, lighter, a moment reclaimed. When the knock came again, it wasn't from Trina. It was from the back door. Daniel stood on the porch, wind pushing at the hem of his jacket. He held a tool bag in one hand and a small voltage reader in the other. Maggie opened the door just enough to let him in, and stepped aside. "Came to check your wiring," he said. "Figured if anyone in this neighborhood was prepared, it'd be you." Maggie offered a nod. "We're running just fine." Daniel scanned the breaker panel, adjusted the generator output, then glanced down the basement steps. "They lose power?" "They lost a lot of things," Maggie replied. He didn't push further, just closed the panel and set down a box of spare D batteries. Before he left, he turned to her. "Most people don't prepare until after they've been hurt. You planned before they saw it coming." "I had to," she said. "They moved in without asking. I've been reacting for 2 years. Now I'm not." Daniel looked at her a moment longer, then nodded, half impressed. "You built a fireproof house and didn't even need a match." As he left, Mrs. Lennox appeared at the edge of the driveway, umbrella in hand, silver hair whipped by the wind. She didn't bother coming in. She just called out from the sidewalk, "You gave them warmth too long, Maggie. Let them learn cold." Maggie watched her go, the umbrella bobbing like a slow metronome against the wind. Inside, Micah flipped the final roasted vegetables onto a chipped serving plate and set them on the table. He looked up at Maggie. "You think they'll figure out this is permanent?" he asked. Maggie opened the drawer beside her and pulled out the old silver cutlery, real metal, no plastic. She laid it on the table one piece at a time, her movements steady. "They're welcome to try," she said, "but the locks don't care how long someone sulks." The electrician arrived just after 10, clipboard in hand, tool belt slung tight across his hips, and an expression that read more skeptical than concerned. He was a local, referred by Daniel, and his truck idled at the curb with a magnetic sign that read, "Hobson Electric, licensed, bonded, unmoved by drama." Maggie met him on the porch, motioned him inside without ceremony, and led him straight to the breaker box in the hallway behind the laundry room. "They said the basement's been acting up," she said evenly. "Power cuts when it shouldn't, lights flicker. I haven't had issues up here." He nodded, already flipping the panel open. "They do any work down there themselves?" Maggie let the silence answer. He crouched down and began inspecting the wiring with a small flashlight and an aging but well-kept multimeter. Every few minutes he muttered to himself, terms Maggie recognized from years of translating appliance repair visits for teachers at her old school. When he finally stood, he rubbed his palm across his chin. They've been messing with this. Sloppy splicing, non-insulated joins, someone bypassed the breaker to run a second outlet string, probably for extra devices. It's not up to code, and more importantly, it's dangerous. Maggie didn't blink. Can you put that in writing? He smiled for the first time. Already did. He handed her a 2-page summary, signed and dated, complete with photos and voltage readings. Maggie accepted the pages like a receipt for a long, unpaid debt. By noon, she had scanned the documents, added them to her digital eviction folder, and uploaded the full file to her legal cloud backup. With a few clicks, she forwarded it all to her attorney of record. Daniel had helped her establish that part too. Quietly, carefully. She was sealing up every corner. The sun was out again by mid-afternoon, but the air stayed heavy, like it hadn't forgiven the storm yet. Maggie found herself in the garden, trimming dead leaves from her rose bushes when Eli approached from the sidewalk. His hands were in his pockets. His face wasn't angry, just worn, tentative. "You got a minute?" he asked. She didn't answer right away, just snipped off a browning stem and dropped it into the bucket beside her. "I don't want this to keep going," he said. "We're family. We don't take each other to court. We talk." Maggie finally looked up. "Family," she repeated, voice dry. "That's what this is?" Eli's mouth tightened. "You've made your point, Mom." Maggie stood fully now, wiping her gloves clean on a dish towel tucked into her waistband. "No," she said softly. "I didn't make a point. You did. On my birthday, with a paper plate. That was your contract." He flinched, just slightly, enough for her to see it land. "We were stressed," he said, trying. "It wasn't about you." She looked at him for a long time, then turned back to the bush. "No, Eli, it was exactly about me. You just didn't think I'd remember it this clearly." He didn't follow her back inside. That evening, Micah sat at the kitchen table, his legs curled beneath him, laptop open but untouched. He looked up as Maggie passed and asked, without fanfare, "Can I just stay up here for good?" Maggie didn't blink. "Yes." He nodded, like that was all he needed. "I'll move the rest of my stuff tomorrow," he added, almost an afterthought. "They haven't noticed what I've already taken." Maggie paused, one hand on the fridge handle. "You sure about this, honey?" Micah shrugged, eyes steady. "You're the only one in the house that's not pretending." She didn't reply, just reached out and gently brushed his hair back from his forehead like she used to when he was 9 and came home sunburned from summer camp. That night, Trina posted a cryptic quote to her social media account, white cursive on a charcoal background. "Respect your elders. They control your comfort." No tags, no context, but the comment thread bloomed like wildfire. Maggie didn't read it. She didn't need to. She had already changed the Wi-Fi password. The moving truck pulled up at 8:47 a.m., a white box van with faded lettering and 2 college-aged workers already arguing over the dolly straps. The sound of the hydraulic lift echoed down the quiet street, breaking the slow rhythm of birdsong and sprinklers. Maggie sat on the porch in her housecoat, legs crossed, a mug of hot tea cradled in both hands. Her gaze followed the movers as they unloaded empty boxes and clipboarded forms. She didn't wave. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. Trina appeared first, hair pulled into a taut bun, oversized sunglasses already perched on her head like a misplaced crown. She barked instructions at the movers before they even reached the front door. "Everything labeled office goes upstairs. The rest, downstairs. Watch the corners. It's original molding." Maggie sipped her tea. Micah sat a few steps below her, earbuds in, sketchpad balanced on his knees. He wasn't drawing anything, just idly dragging pencil lines across the paper, like a muscle he was keeping warm. The movers filed past with boxes, one after another, labeled in Sharpie, Trina's shoes, Miss Decor, Keurig Plus pods, gym bands. Maggie noticed none of the boxes said, "family photos." There likely weren't any left to pack. Inside, the living room was half bare, the basement already hollowing out. Trina moved like a woman trying to control the narrative of a house that no longer listened to her. She flung open cabinets and yanked open drawers as if speed could grant her back authority. When one of the movers accidentally nudged a side table too hard against the wall, chipping a bit of plaster, Trina lost her grip. "Oh my God, are you all trained or just breathing?" The young mover, barely 20, apologized quietly and kept going. "You're getting paid for this," she snapped, spinning in place, looking for someone else to blame. When her eyes landed on Maggie through the screen door, the simmer boiled over. "You think this is dignified, sitting out here watching your own son get evicted?" Maggie stood without a word, stepped back inside, and closed the door. The new lock clicked once, then again. Trina's shouting was muffled now, rage dulled by hardware and boundary. Downstairs, Eli was trying to keep the movers on task, but he looked frayed. Every item packed seemed to age him. Every unplugged device felt like a thread being snipped. Eventually, he walked up the steps with a final box marked Micah's room and paused in the hallway. Micah stood there, his duffel bag at his side, arms folded. Eli lowered the box. "You coming with us?" Micah shook his head. "I'm staying with Grandma." Eli blinked, trying to process. "We'll be staying in a rental for a while. It's got a futon. It's not forever." "I know," Micah said quietly, "but she never lied to me." Eli exhaled, slow and bitter. "She made this harder than it needed to be." "No," Micah replied. "She just stopped making it easy." They didn't hug. Eli carried the box out to the truck without another word. By the time the last load was stacked, the house was calm again. Maggie opened the door only once to hand one of the movers a check and 2 bottles of water. She didn't look at Trina. Trina didn't speak. 20 minutes later, the truck pulled away. Trina and Eli followed in their SUV, taillights blinking into the distance. The silence they left behind felt not empty but cleared, like something heavy had finally exhaled. Daniel arrived just after noon, toolbox under one arm, a thumb drive in the other. Maggie walked him through the updated panel, the final keypad reconfiguration, and the confirmation that all old access codes were purged. "You want to assign new backups?" he asked. "I already have one," she said, glancing toward the hallway, where Micah stood barefoot, leaning against the doorframe with a bag of kettle corn in his hand. Later that evening, Maggie sat at the dining room table with a manila envelope in front of her. The house deed. She unfolded the notarized amendment paperwork she'd drafted last week, slid it across the table to Daniel, and nodded. "Add Micah as successor trustee, immediate transfer upon death, no contest clause." Daniel clicked his pen. "You're sure?" "I've never been more." He signed and dated the necessary fields. Maggie added her initials beside the change and sealed the envelope with the calm finality of a woman reclaiming her name in ink. The photographer arrived 20 minutes early, a young woman in denim and boots who smelled faintly of citrus and old camera bags. She had a notepad in one back pocket and a cannon strapped across her chest like a crossbow. Maggie had offered to brew coffee, but the woman politely declined, already walking the perimeter of the living room, adjusting light exposure in her mind. "We'll shoot a few here and maybe one on the porch," the woman said, more to herself than anyone else. "That wallpaper, it's kind of perfect, vintage, but not fussy." Micah came down the stairs, adjusting the collar of a button-up shirt Maggie hadn't seen him wear since sophomore year picture day. "I'll do the porch photo," he said, voice clear. "She's more herself outside." The photographer arched an eyebrow. "You're the grandson?" He nodded. "I take a few shots for yearbook. I've got a decent eye." Maggie watched them exchange technical jargon over aperture settings and shutter speeds. She felt strangely outside her own moment, like watching a version of herself she hadn't realized she'd grown into. The piece had started as a local feature, one of those human interest filler stories tucked between zoning disputes and high school swim meets. But the journalist who interviewed Maggie had leaned forward more than once, pen scratching faster when Maggie recounted the paper plate. The final title ran in block letters across the Sunday lifestyle section, "The Quiet Lockout, How a Widow Took Back Her Home Without Raising Her Voice." The article was fair, empathetic even. Maggie's words were quoted directly, the tone reverent but not pitiful. Her photo, shot by Micah, captured her standing on the porch in soft morning light, arms crossed over her chest, one eyebrow arched, an expression that seemed to say, "I'm not what you expected, am I?" By noon, the article had made its way online. Comments trickled in at first, then poured like a crack in a dam. Good for her? About time someone stood up to the guilt trip generation. Reminds me of my own mother. We need to protect women like this. Trina predictably responded beneath an anonymous username, a long paragraph laced with phrases like emotional manipulation, rewriting history, and elder weaponizing narrative control. But the internet, especially the local internet, wasn't interested in her version anymore. The replies stacked up quickly. "Sit down, Trina. You lost the right to speak when you handed her a plastic fork." Maggie read the comments once, then closed the browser and didn't open it again. Letters began arriving by the end of the week. Handwritten notes, envelopes with careful cursive, seniors from downstate, retirees from Florida who'd seen a repost in a legal Facebook group, even a widow in Oregon who included a photograph of the shed she'd just had rekeyed with the caption, "You inspired me." Maggie kept them all in a shoebox by the phone. She hadn't written back yet, but she would. Eventually, when the city council invited her to speak at a town hall on elder empowerment and estate control, she'd laughed at first. Then she bought a new blazer just in case. Micah watched her rehearse the night before in the living room, note cards fanned across the coffee table. "You nervous?" he asked. She shook her head. "I'm used to speaking at PTA meetings." Those women were scarier than any councilman. At the actual event, she stood at a modest podium in a borrowed church rec center, the same room she'd once chaperoned spelling bees in. This time, the audience leaned forward, listening like her words held keys. "Control isn't always about power," she told them. "Sometimes it's just about not being erased." They stood to clap when she finished. Not a standing ovation, but the real kind. The kind where people don't look at each other first to decide if they should rise. Afterward, Mrs. Lennox met her by the punch table and handed her a small manila folder. "You've got another one scheduled," she said. "Community legal aid, Thursday night." Maggie raised an eyebrow. "Are you my agent now?" Mrs. Lennox grinned. "This is your second career, sweetheart. You might as well start treating it like one." The notary came to the house on a Tuesday. She was polite, middle-aged, and wore a raincoat that looked like it had weathered 5 Midwestern Februaries. She set her briefcase on the dining room table and flipped through pages with the kind of steady rhythm Maggie respected. "This one designates him sole heir. No co-trustees, no alternates," the notary said, tapping the line with her pen. Micah sat at the far end of the table, a little stunned, shoulders square, jaw tight in the way boys get when they're trying not to show too much. "You don't have to say anything," Maggie told him, uncapping her pen. "Just know I'm not doing this out of guilt. I'm doing it because you watched more than they ever realized." He gave a small nod. "I didn't do that much." "You did enough," she said, signing, with calm, steady strokes. When it was finished, the documents were placed in the same gray lockbox Daniel had installed weeks ago. Maggie set it back in her closet, then made a second digital copy, encrypted, backed up, and labeled in a folder called Legacy. Final and settled. Later that week, she met with her attorney, Daniel's father, a reserved man who looked like he'd spent the last 3 decades winning cases without ever raising his voice. Together, they finalized the clauses. Micah as sole executor, no contest clause reinforced, digital protections enabled. In the event of dispute or attempted override, the system would notify a chain of attorneys and trustees in 3 states. "And the grant language?" Maggie asked. "Already drafted," the lawyer replied. "It's modest, but it'll cover 2 full legal consultations per month for local seniors. I've got paralegals interested in donating hours." Maggie reached into her purse and pulled out a check. It wasn't enormous, but it was hers. That evening, she and Micah stood at the basement stairs. "So this is what you want it to be?" he asked, peering down into the space that had once been half theirs, half someone else's weapon. "A studio," Maggie said. "Independent entrance, exposed brick if we can save it. Maybe a reading nook where Trina used to park her treadmill." Micah smiled. "You gonna rent it out?" "Eventually," she said, "but first I'm reclaiming it." They descended the steps together, flashlights in hand, the air faintly damp with stillness. Maggie walked to the corner where her old cedar chest had been shoved. Dust lined the lid. She opened it and pulled out a faded patchwork quilt, hand-stitched by her mother-in-law, long before Trina had redecorated everything into gray and cream. "Let's build forward with what was actually ours," she said, folding the quilt over her arm. The next morning, Maggie received a call she didn't recognize. She let it go to voicemail. Trina's voice was faint but unmistakable, unapologetic, careful in the way liars are when they think they're about to lose something they didn't earn. "Hi, Maggie, just wanted to check in. Things got heated, we all said things we didn't mean. I'd love to have a real conversation. As family, maybe we can meet halfway." Maggie blocked the number without listening to the rest. An hour later, a florist rang the doorbell. A tall arrangement of white lilies and soft pink roses stood on the porch, wrapped in cellophane and tied with an ivory bow. The card read, in Eli's handwriting, "We're sorry. Miss you." Maggie handed the bouquet back to the delivery boy. "No forwarding address," she said, and closed the door behind her. By evening, the basement had been cleared of its last boxes. The carpet had been rolled, the treadmill listed for free on Craigslist, the old TV sold to a college kid who barely made eye contact but said, "Thank you, ma'am," before driving off in a dusty Civic. Daniel arrived late, toolbox in one hand and a thermos in the other. "You're really doing it," he said, eyeing the blueprints she'd laid out on the folding table. "I've lived with ghosts in this house too long," she replied. "It's time to rent the rooms to someone alive." He chuckled. "Name it yet?" Maggie nodded. "The Dorsey Studio. Nothing fancy, just honest." The kitchen smelled like buttercream and lemon zest. A real cake sat on the counter, 3 tiers, frosted smooth, with pale yellow roses piped by someone who knew what celebration was supposed to look like. No store-sheet cake, no plastic fork. Maggie stood at the sink polishing the last of the dinner plates. Porcelain, white with a cobalt ring. They hadn't seen the light of day in years, tucked into the high cupboard after John passed, brought down now with care. There were 12 settings, and today everyone would be used. She wore a navy dress with sleeves that fluttered when she moved. Simple, unapologetic. Her hair was swept back, her lipstick soft. It wasn't vanity, it was precision. Today, the message was clear. This is my home. This is my story. And this is how I mark time now. At exactly 3 p.m., the doorbell rang. She opened it to find Mrs. Lennox holding a worn envelope and a tray of deviled eggs. "They're not fancy," the old woman said, stepping inside. "But they've got paprika. That counts for flair." "I'd take paprika over pity any day," Maggie replied, ushering her in. The house filled slowly, and then all at once. Neighbors Maggie hadn't seen since the pandemic brought casseroles and wine. Mr. Thomas from 3 doors down brought a folding chair, just in case. One of Micah's favorite teachers showed up with a card and a mason jar of home-pickled carrots. Nobody asked where Trina was. Nobody mentioned Eli. At 3:45, Mrs. Lennox tapped her glass and handed Maggie a photo. It was from the original birthday dinner, cropped now, carefully torn down the middle. Only Maggie remained in the frame, seated stiffly at the table, a paper plate in front of her. "Thought you might want the half that mattered," she said. Maggie didn't speak right away. She just folded the photo in half again, smaller now, tighter, and tucked it into the back pocket of her recipe binder. At 4 o'clock, Micah cleared his throat. "I have something." He reached into a small gift bag and pulled out a slim velvet box. Inside was a bracelet, stainless steel, understated, with an engraving on the inner band. Maggie turned it over to read 410, code set. Silence broken. She looked up at him, eyes soft. "Micah, it's beautiful. I wanted you to remember the day you stopped waiting for permission." Maggie laughed, full and warm. "I should have done it with glitter locks, maybe a disco padlock. Really send a message." "I can still make that happen," Daniel said, stepping forward with a grin and a box of his own. But in the meantime, he opened the lid to reveal 2 upgraded keypad panels, sleeker than the last, voice-enabled and rain-resistant. "Programmable to your voice. No more numbers if you don't want 'em," he said. "They're the ones I use at my firm. Safe as a vault, but friendlier." She reached for the box, not quite taking it, just resting her fingers against the edge. "You keep showing up," she said. Daniel shrugged. "So do you." As twilight stretched through the windows and the dining table was cleared of cake crumbs and candle wax, Maggie stood with a glass of sparkling cider raised in one hand. "I never planned on doing birthdays twice," she said. "But it turns out, sometimes you don't get it right the first time." Chairs creaked. Someone chuckled. Micah stood beside her, relaxed in a way he hadn't been in months. She scanned the room, faces lit by fading sunlight and kitchen lamps, real laughter bouncing off real china. "So here's to the locks that held," Maggie continued, voice clear. "And the people who didn't." They drank. They clapped. They stayed longer than they meant to. And as the guests filtered out, hugging her at the door, some leaving thank you notes and others taking home leftover cake, no one asked about the family who hadn't shown up. Maggie turned off the porch light after the last car pulled away, then glanced down at the bracelet on her wrist. The date glinted back at her like a boundary etched in silver. She smiled to herself. Then she turned the new lock, felt it click smooth and sure, and walked back into her own house, unafraid of the dark. The courtroom was colder than expected. Pale gray walls, fluorescent lighting that buzzed faintly overhead, and rows of wooden pew-style benches that forced good posture whether you wanted it or not. Maggie sat in the front row, a navy wool coat folded neatly in her lap, her back straight, her hands still. Micah was beside her in a black button-down and slacks that still bore faint creases from being folded too long. He hadn't said much since they'd entered the courthouse, but his silence wasn't nervous. It was deliberate, protective. Across the aisle, Trina whispered furiously into her attorney's ear, one heel bouncing, one perfectly manicured nail tapping a rhythm of panic on the edge of the table. Her hair was curled tighter than usual, and her smile, when she remembered to flash one, looked more like a dare than a gesture of goodwill. Eli sat farther back, alone. His tie was slightly askew, his hands restless. He looked thinner than Maggie remembered, not in body, but in presence. The judge entered, brisk and unsentimental. Docket 3189, Dorsey versus Dorsey, petition to dispute property transfer, claim of unlawful eviction. The opposing counsel began first, sharp-suited and confident. She spoke of miscommunication, of generational misunderstandings, of blurred lines between familial obligation and legal responsibility. She was hurt, the lawyer said of Trina. She responded emotionally, but none of that rises to the level of exclusion or malice. We're asking for a fair review of tenancy and inheritance. The judge raised one brow and nodded toward Maggie's attorney. Response? Daniel stood slowly. No theatrics, no raised voice. He began with the plate. A clear photo projected onto the screen, taken from the night of the original birthday dinner, sharp and damning. There sat Maggie at the end of the table, paper plate bent slightly, plastic fork catching the light. Around her, china gleamed, silver caught reflections. And in the background, Trina laughing. Then came the screenshots, text messages where Trina referred to Maggie as emotional, in the way, not exactly useful anymore. The court fell still as one message appeared, dated 3 days before the lock change. Let's just wait her out. She can't live forever. Then the video footage from the hallway camera Daniel had installed, Trina entering the basement without notice. Eli, unplugging appliances and muttering something Maggie's lawyer let the court read from subtitles. She won't even notice. She never goes down here anymore. Finally, the deed, the amended trust, the notarized no contest clause, and a signed inspection report from Hobson Electric that outlined tampered wires, illegal outlets, and dangerous overloads, all confirmed to have been installed post-occupancy. When Daniel was finished, he simply turned off the projector, stepped back, and said, "All we ask is that the law honor the boundaries it already wrote." The courtroom remained hushed. The judge removed her glasses, folded them gently, and looked first at Trina, then at Maggie. "Petition is denied," she said flatly, "and dismissed with prejudice." Trina made a sound, a half gasp, half growl, but her attorney put a hand on her arm before she could speak. The gavel struck once, Maggie didn't exhale until it was over. As they stood to leave, Eli met her eyes. He didn't speak, didn't move toward her. He just mouthed the word, sorry, barely audible, barely formed. It hung there like steam off a cup, visible but weightless. Micah looped an arm around Maggie's shoulders as they walked into the hallway. "Let's never let that back in again," he said, not as a question, as a promise. Mrs. Lennox was waiting by the vending machines with a wrapped sandwich and a smug look that didn't need translation. Daniel gave her a high five that drew stares from two passing paralegals. Maggie didn't stop walking until they reached the doors that opened into the cold. She breathed it in. December crisp, sharp, real. Something in her chest finally clicked loose. 2 days later, a local news story aired under the headline, "Woman wins right to her home. Now she's sharing the tools." The segment showed Maggie in her living room, standing beside a folding table stacked with pamphlets and grant forms. She spoke plainly to the camera, explaining the new security installation fund, her courtroom compensation repurposed for elderly homeowners who felt watched, pressured, or erased in their own homes. "We can't always argue louder," she said, "but we can lock tighter, we can prepare sooner, and we can make sure the next person doesn't have to wait until they're broken to take action." The grant applications opened the next morning. By lunch, the inbox was full. The smell of cinnamon rolls had started wafting through the neighborhood by 9 a.m. Inside Maggie's kitchen, the table was set for 8. Real linens, glass tumblers, chipped but loved china. A bowl of clementines sat in the center, flanked by a small vase of backyard daisies and a ceramic pitcher filled with orange juice. The brunch wasn't grand, but it was steady. Ritual. The kind of gathering that grew roots. Mrs. Lennox arrived first, as always, bearing a still-warm coffee cake wrapped in a faded dish towel that looked like it had seen decades of Thanksgiving mornings. She walked in without knocking. She always did now. "You've got a better turnout than Rotary this week," she said, setting the cake down. "Darlene from the post office is here, and she brought peach jam. Real stuff, not store-bought." "Bless her," Maggie replied, pouring a fresh pot of coffee. "That jam gets people to talk more than I do." By 10, the living room had filled with the sound of soft laughter, spoons clinking, and voices that no longer needed to lower themselves. Women over 65, most of them widowed or long divorced, gathered with their cardigans draped over chairbacks and stories finally reaching the parts they'd never told their children. They called it the retreat. It started after the article. It became monthly after the ruling. Maggie never had to send reminders, just opened the door on the first Sunday and let it unfold. Downstairs, the Dorsey studio was nearly complete. A muralist from Joliet had moved in that month, early 50s, newly retired from teaching high school art, trying to find herself again through brushstrokes. She paid a reduced rent, cleaned up after herself, and sometimes left paint-stained postcards on Maggie's back steps that read things like, "This week felt like freedom." Thank you, Micah had taken the idea and run with it. He'd built a small but elegant website, midnight blue with gold accents, Maggie's photo in grayscale on the homepage beneath a simple title, "Hold the Line, Legal Tools for Elders Who Say No." There were links to pro bono applications, pre-filled estate templates, and a section called The Lock Files that explained, without bitterness, how to draw a boundary without burning down your house. Mrs. Lennox began baking every Sunday now, not just for brunch, but for donations. Carrot cake for one neighbor, pecan bars for a social worker, lemon loaves wrapped with legal pamphlets and recipe cards. The tins came back empty, but always with folded checks inside. Quiet contributions, respect paid in cash and calories. And still, the inbox grew. By late January, Maggie had 6 invitations to speak, 2 libraries, a radio spot, 1 out-of-state senior law panel. She didn't say yes to all of them. She wasn't chasing spotlight. She was answering questions that too many people were too scared to ask. On the last Sunday of the month, while washing the final set of teacups, Maggie saw a slim envelope resting on the windowsill. No stamp, just her name in Eli's handwriting. She stared at it for a long moment before reaching for it with a dry hand. Inside, a single sheet of paper, 1 paragraph, something between apology and appeal. something that asked for nothing directly, but curled itself around the margins of forgiveness. Maggie folded it twice, walked to the backyard, and set it gently in the rusted fire pit John had built in '94. She struck a match. The flame caught slow, then curled golden, swallowing the words whole. She didn't look away. When she turned back toward the house, Micah was standing in the doorway with his camera. "Thought you might want a portrait," he said. "Right there, with the smoke." Maggie looked down at her hands, steady, warm, streaked with ash. Then she looked up and smiled. "Take it." He clicked once. No flash. Just proof. It was just after sunrise when Maggie stood on the porch with the new keypad panel in her hand. The air smelled like thawing earth. Spring not quite here, but coming. The porch wood was still damp from last night's rain, and a few wrens chattered from the gutters like they'd already called dibs on the season. Maggie entered the code slowly. Not out of hesitation, but intention. Each press felt like a keystroke in a final sentence. 7 digits. Not random, not forgettable. When the soft chime confirmed the change, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. Neat handwriting, no flourishes. She tucked it into Micah's palm as he joined her at the top step. "Only you," she said. Micah looked down at it, then up at her. "You sure?" Maggie smiled. "I was sure before I changed it." They stepped back inside together. No urgency, no shadows trailing behind them. Just the creak of wood floors and the light slanting in sideways through clean windows. No tension anymore. Just home. She walked him through the house the way she had once walked him through the rules of crossing streets, of tying shoes, of letting go when the time was right. Each room had been touched by her hand, reclaimed, reset. The kitchen now held jars labeled with herbs grown from cuttings in old teacups. The living room had an extra reading chair Micah had thrifted and restored himself. Finally, they reached the door at the end of the hall, a room most guests never saw. Maggie unlocked it with a brass key worn at the teeth. Inside, shelves lined with labeled binders, rows of recipe cards in a cedar box, and thick envelopes containing deeds, letters, affidavits, every corner of her life, printed and archived. Micah ran a hand along one of the cabinets. "It's like a vault," he said. "Exactly," Maggie replied. "Every good house needs one, for truth, for tools, for when someone tries to pretend you never had either." Micah turned toward her. "What if they show up again?" Maggie didn't flinch. She stepped closer and tapped the panel beside the door with one finger. "Then they'll meet the lawyer first." They laughed softly, an inside joke now, the kind forged in aftermath and carried through repair. Outside, the sun had finally risen high enough to catch the corner of the house. Maggie walked back to the porch, where the keypad now gleamed beneath the morning light. The new panel had a small metal label beneath the numbers, Micah's idea etched yesterday. "Respect required to enter." She brushed a thumb across the edge of the brass and stepped back inside. The door clicked shut behind her. Not loud, not final, just secure. She turned once, eyes tracing the calm geometry of her living room, the faint smell of cinnamon still in the air from yesterday's coffee cake, and the framed photo Micah had taken weeks ago, her silhouette in front of rising smoke. It wasn't revenge anymore, it was record-keeping. It was legacy. She sat at the dining table, tea steaming beside her, and opened her journal to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote, "Final entry code." Then beneath it, in darker ink, "They handed me plastic. I handed them silence, and a lock they'll never crack."